Hi everyone. In this module, what we're going to be doing is diving into ZBrush for the purposes of concepting. We're going to be dealing with the basic interface first so that you can understand what we're diving into by checking out many of the different features that you can use so that you're comfortable when we actually want to start concepting something. So let's get started. All right, so we've got the ZBrush interface here right now, and it may look pretty intimidating, and to be honest, it kind of is. The user interface itself is a little bit not terribly obvious. For example, if you start trying to paint right away, we're not really dealing with a 3D model. We're dealing with this weird 2D space that exists inside ZBrush to begin with, which is not really what we want. Also, if you start to scroll up to the top, we'll start seeing alpha as the first thing that we have to click, as opposed to things like file and the sorts of options that we're pretty used to in most applications. So where we actually want to start is over here in the tool section. This is the main thing that's going to be driving everything we do inside of ZBrush. So the first thing you want to do is grab pretty much any one of these objects here. These are tools. These tools will allow us to actually be able to sculpt and do various things. They're sort of predefined objects that we can use or sculpt with. So if we click one of these, if we click it again, we'll also see that basically we've got options of a variety of different things that we could work with. But for now, we've clicked the cylinder. We could click sphere. I find that to be one of the better pieces to start with. But if I start to try to draw it onto the canvas or anything, well, we see our sphere appear. If we wanted to start sculpting that, we could try brushing on again, but in this case, we're still only creating these spheres over and over and over again. And although this is interesting and there are artists who use this interface, it's kind of confusing to work with. Now what we are going to do is press Control N, because basically what we've created here is actually just a document. ZBrush has two different things that it can export. It can export documents specifically and objects, 3D models. So the first thing that we're dealing with is under the Document tab, and we don't really want to work with anything in here. So we could actually just say New Document or the standard Control N. That will basically clear the canvas here. We are basically almost never working with this document palette. This is an old deprecated piece of ZBrush that we don't need or particularly use, especially not for concept 99.9% of the time. So we are going to drop in this piece here, but there's one thing that we want to do is we're not working with that canvas anymore. We're working with the object. So we want to go with Edit Object. So there we go. Now, if we click on this empty space, we can see that we are rotating around. It's a little bit hard to see in this case. So, you know what? Over top of this object, try to paint on it. Well, you see we can't. This is one of the things that's frustrating with ZBrush, is its first steps are very intimidating and needlessly confusing. So for example, here you're seeing, to enable sculpting, please convert blah, blah, blah. The main thing is that this object is a primitive 3D object which you can't sculpt for some reason. There's a number of initialization reasons, but for you, it's kind of annoying. You want to press this Make Polymesh 3D button. It'll make an extra mesh in here. This one we can actually sculpt on. So if you just start drawing on top of this, then you'll see that we're actually able to start sculpting. Now, let's just recap here real quick, because those were a bunch of buttons and a bunch of options here. It may seem like a lot of work, but it's not. Basically, anytime you start out, pick a tool from over here. I'm just going to press Control N again, or actually turn off Edit, Control N, start off with where we were. I'm going to pick that object that I want. It could even be the star in this case, but let's go with the sphere. Put it onto our canvas, go to Edit, make sure that we turn it into a Polymesh 3D object, and then you can start sculpting. So now I can start sculpting on this object. If I want to rotate, all I have to do is start to click and drag in this empty space over here. And that'll work just fine for me. So that's pretty good. If I wanted to zoom, there is one option that is a little bit awkward. Basically, if you hold Alt and click and drag in that empty space again, you'll also pan. Now, if you hold Alt, click to do that panning, but let go of Alt, keeping your mouse still pressed down, then you'll be able to zoom in and out. It is one of the more awkward ways of zooming in any kind of 3D application I've ever worked with. But once you get the hang of it, you're going to get a pretty good sense of how to move around. So again, that's just kind of Alt to pan, just left click to sort of rotate around, and Alt, left click and drag, then let go of Alt, still holding your clicking so that you can zoom in and out. You start to get used to it. It's a little bit weird, but Generally speaking, it's going to be fine. Now, if we want to start sculpting, the sculpting itself and our brush size is based on where we are in our viewport here. So as we zoom in and out, it's going to stay the same size with what we're working with here. Now, if we want to increase the size of that, we can start to scroll up here and see what options we have to work with. So for example, Z intensity, draw size, focal shift, all these buttons through here, too many. The main thing we want to focus on is we have Z add generally turned on by default. That means that we are actually going to be pushing out the surfaces themselves. If we went with mRGB, what that means is we're adding materials to our object. Don't worry about that right now. RGB means we would be painting the object itself with color. That's useful. We'll use that later. M means we would just be applying material information. So mRGB is both these two pieces combined at once. Now we can have any of them all individually turned on at any given moment, but in this case we just want Z add. If we clicked Z sub, then you'll see here that I'm pushing into my surface instead. Now I can also toggle that by holding Alt. So for example, you see here, I'm kind of pushing stuff out. If I hold Alt, then I'm going to start pushing things in. It's the opposite of whatever the effect is that I'm currently doing. Now, if I wanted to increase the size of it, I could go to Draw Size, increase the size of that a little bit more, and start lifting up. If I wanted to smooth, I can hold Shift, which will switch my brush to smooth mode, and I can start brushing on top of the surface and smooth things out. So that's pretty good. Gives me something to work with here. Now, what if I wanted to increase the intensity? So for example, you see here, I can brush on. If I increase the intensity with a little bit of brushing, I do a lot more now. So I could sort of cut into that surface a lot more than I was before. Reducing that Z intensity is useful. Focal shift will change the shape or intensity of the brush that I'm placing down. So for example, you see here, I have a really hard-edged kind of detail that's being stamped on. If I reduce that focal shift, then I get a lot more like sort of small dots that are appearing. Basically, the brush shape that is going to be appearing here is kind of a default. Here, you basically don't see it because it's kind of soft. Now, this will change per brush and per alpha that you're using, depending on what you have going on. For now, though, it's not too much of a big deal. Let's just stick with what we've got here, and we can start to just kind of drop stuff in, hold Shift to kind of smooth some of it out. Now, we need shortcut keys because having to go back up here is a little bit too slow. So S, for example, will give me easy access to draw size. So I can increase that just with this little dock that appears wherever I click S. It's very, very handy and will speed up your workflow a lot. Now, on top of that, what are the other ones? Well, if I go up here, I can see Z intensity is set to U. Focal shift is set to O. So if I press U on my keyboard, I get quick access to Z intensity. If I press O, I get quick access to focal shift. If I hold spacebar, I actually get access to a lot of stuff. This is useful because I can actually start to change a number of options in here really, really easily, just right away. So I could increase this or decrease that if I didn't want to remember those shortcut keys. So that's very handy for me as well. I could also change colors, but for now, let's not deal with that. If I start to fiddle with this at the moment, then my mesh just starts to get darker, and it's a little bit confusing, so we won't work with this right now. So that's pretty good. That gives me some basic stuff to work with here, and I can pretty much start sculpting right away. So actually, let's just go to another one of these objects here. You'll notice, if I switch my tool, I'm using a different piece than I was using before. This one is sculpted, this one is not. So in fact, I could just start, this one needs to be turned into a Polymesh 3D. You saw that warning that just comes up here. If you try to sculpt it, turn it into Polymesh 3D. PM3D will also signify that it is a Polymesh 3D object. So I could start actually starting to sculpt into this if I wanted to. Control Z works the same way that it would normally. And I could start to just kind of draw in whatever I wanted here. Starting to make a creature's face or something like that. So anything that I basically wanted to start working with in here, I could start doing. Gives me a fair amount of wiggle room. I could start to kind of block in some big basic forms. But, you know, the intensity is a little bit high, and on top of that, I want a little bit more control here, and I'd like the other side to be dealt with too. And that is what we're going to start dealing with in our next clip. But last, I need to save. So how do we do that? Well, if I go up here to Save As, I can save my tool as a Z tool. So in here, I'm just basically going to say, let's save this as something simple. Just basically test model. And I can save it as a Z tool. If I press, just so we're clear, if I press Control S, then I'm saving a project. A ZProject file will actually contain all of these various pieces inside of it. So it's a slight difference between the two of them. A Z tool only saves the tool by itself, and a Z project saves all of my used tools. So that's the main thing. So again though, in our next clip, we're going to be dealing with a little bit more detail in sculpting.